And then Erica, would you just like tell us if it's kind of good to start?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Like, are they, would we see them or do we just see their questions?
You'll see their names pop up in the attendees.
Okay.
You should see it. Oh, we're live.
Great, thank you. Oh, here we go. It's like there's a countdown, but we don't hear it. Okay. We'll give everyone a minute or two for people to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, seems we're ready. We have so far 16 people in attendance. Good morning, everyone. My name is Loy Amira Almeron. I'm a documentary film producer, and recently I co-produced the film Black Mothers Love and Resist. And I was in charge and producer for public records requests in California and in Alabama for the film. And I'm very much honored to be moderating this panel with our distinguished speakers here with us. I'll let them introduce themselves more. We have Sheila Albers, Mark Schmid, and Jim Leahy. And I guess, we can get started. I am wondering if we can give each one of you time to talk a little bit about yourself, how you got into basically this panel of with open records, your case. These are all panelists who have experience in requesting, not only requesting, but really demanding for public records as we need them. And so, yeah, just to talk a little bit about yourself, how you got started in this, and really why. Would like to start, Sheila?
Sure, I'll be happy to start. First of all, thank you, Lloyd, for moderating, and thank you to the NFOIC for giving Jim, Mark, and I this opportunity. I came to open records work due, sadly, to what I think causes many average citizens to get involved in open records work, and that is a tragedy. January 20th of 2018, my 17-year-old son was in the middle of a mental health crisis. We were not home at the time. He posted on social media that he was considering ending his life. He felt it was all over. And his friends called 911. And the officers who came to my home did not attempt to knock on the door or make contact with John. They, one of them ran to a car to get a phone, and the other one took kind of a position by the garage. And John took my minivan keys, and the garage door opened slowly, and John began to back the minivan out of the garage. The officer was not in the path of the vehicle. He did not announce himself as a police officer. He yelled, "Stop," that was it, and fired 2 shots into the van. The van then kind of spun around, and the officer yelled, "Stop," again, and he stepped out of the way and then fired 11 more shots into the van, 6 of which struck and killed John almost instantaneously. He was unarmed at the time. He was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And we started to live an unimaginable nightmare. Why we got into the open records work specifically, because we were not getting answers. Every parent wants to know the circumstances under which you would lose a child, especially in such an unnecessary and horrific manner. So that is why I began open record work. But the person who actually spearheaded it for my son's case and really got the ball rolling is my good friend, Mark Schmid.
Thanks, Sheila. So Sheila and I are extended family members. My son's wife is Sheila's niece, and after John's death, this police shooting in 2018, began wondering, what happened, what took place, and the explanation that we received initially, approximately a month after the shooting in February of 2018, was that the officer involved was not going to be charged by our local prosecutor, and in so doing, he gave out a media fact sheet that we can show you in a little bit. But the gist of it was the media fact sheet by the prosecutor said that John was backing out of the garage aggressively, at an extremely fast pace, and was going directly at the officer. Well, the videos that were shown at the news conference announcing that there would be no charges showed that the particular officer was in no danger and was actually off to the side of the minivan. So that raised a lot of questions about what was taking place. So, time went by after the shooting, after the announcement that no charges would be filed. And ultimately, Sheila and her husband retained counsel and filed a lawsuit. As a result of that, in the very early stages of that lawsuit, the judge issued a stay order on discovery, which meant that really the fact-finding process of a lawsuit wasn't going to go forward until all of the other issues about whether or not the case would be allowed to proceed would be resolved. And that would be months and months. So I was not at all covered by the stay order. And I was somewhat familiar with Kansas Open Record Act requests through, I'm a retired lawyer, and through my profession somewhat knew about it. But I dug into that, and that's when I started essentially conducting my own discovery, or trying to conduct my own discovery to see what I could find out about what John's case involved. Why did this happen? really wanted to get the facts, and that's really what got this whole thing going.
Jim?
Hi, thank you. My name's Jim Leedy. I'm a member of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability, also for Spokane Community Against Racism. I'm a United States Army veteran. I've been doing open records advocacy, if I could say that, for about 5 years now. And it all started when my buddy Craig Johnson was killed by Bonner County deputies in 2017. Craig was like a brother to me. We met when I was a disc jockey on the radio, and him and his buddy Miles Kennedy started a band called Mayfield 4, and they had just signed with Sony Records and stuff. And he would call me up in the middle of the night while I was on the air, and we'd talk. He was like an uncle to my children. And we skip ahead to 2017, and him and his wife had gotten into a bit of an argument, and he headed off to Priest Lake, Idaho, where he had a cabin up at Coolin, Idaho. And his wife hadn't heard from him for a while, so she called the Bonner County sheriff to see if he could swing up there and do a welfare check. And we didn't realize how dangerous that was going to be. She was calling for help, and we didn't get help. A Deputy Madden, showed up at the house at midnight, and he did not have his police lights on or anything. Craig walked out of his cabin with a gun, trying to see who this person who was. It just intruded onto his property because it was out in the middle of the woods. And he was on his porch and was yelling at whoever it was to get off his property, and he had a gun with him. And the incident lasted 60 seconds. And it ended when Craig walked back into his cabin, and Deputy Madden drove back to the police station. But he had a bruised ego, so he got a warrant for Craig's arrest for assault on an officer. Later on, he would admit that Craig never aimed the gun at him. On September 26, 2017, they came back with what they call emergency response team, which is basically a SWAT team, a tactical team, with an armored vehicle and 2 snipers. They hid the snipers in the woods. When Craig finally came out of his cabin, he didn't see where the police were because they were parked on the backside of it. So he stepped around and took a look, and that spooked one of the snipers, Ted Swanstrom, and he yelled sheriff, supposedly. And then the other deputy fired twice, hitting Craig in the back and killing him. And they're supposed to have body cams. There was 9 deputies there that day, and they were supposed to have body cams. Every single one of them did not have their body cam with them. So based on that and what the police were saying had taken place, it was so out of character for what I knew of Craig. I had to find out what really happened. So I started doing records requests, learning how to do records requests, and started finding a lot of things that were wrong. Just by getting the records and analyzing the interviews, the photos, and learning that with them saying that he had a gun when he walked out of the cabin really didn't seem possible, because the gun that they claim he had was completely clean, despite being kicked through the dirt. There was no fingerprints, no DNA. And a whole slew of other issues. So that started me, like a lot of other people, getting into police accountability and public records requests. Unfortunately, it took a tragedy.
Thank you, everyone. I'll share a little bit about, the film that I co-produced. It's called Black Mothers Love and Resist. And really, it's also, unfortunately, due to tragedy that we started this film. It's about 2 mothers who are looking for justice for their children who were brutally, one was killed by a police officer here in the Bay Area, and another was beaten brutally in Alabama. And so we wanted to follow that journey of these mothers. And, unfortunately, it's also like really asking for a lot of public records that will not be given to you in most cases in Alabama. And in California, it's a little bit different. It's really kind of like an opposites to us with California and Alabama. And so that's really the big part of the journey in the film was, the big thing for us was to find the body cam footage. Like Jim was saying, like they had multiple officers and they had body cameras, and very convenient that, of course, the main guy who beat our protagonist, his body camera was off. And it seems like they said that he turned it off intentionally before he did the beating. But we never got to actually see any footage from that or anything that would corroborate, because it's very sealed, very tight-lipped in Alabama. I kind of wanted to talk about, the goals and how, the things you were learning as you kind of go through this process. Like for us, it's more simple. I would think we want to find answers so that we can actually make this film. Like documentaries are not really stories that, are unfortunately not very successful. There are a lot of records that we didn't get. The body cam, we still don't have it. No one has it. So I want to talk about what was your purpose? What did you want to find out when you started this process, and kind of like, what did you learn along the way about open records laws, either in your state or in your local area? And kind of just to also put it out there for our attendees, please feel free to put in your questions in the chat. We'll have them answered. We'll try to have them answered along the way. We want to make this a more conversation between each other. And that goes too for like the panelists among the four of us.
Why would it be possible for you to put up the media fact sheet?
Sounds good.
So this is the press release that was issued on February 20, the date of the press conference, where the district attorney announced that there would be no charges filed against the officer who shot and killed John. If you could scroll down just a little bit further, let's go to the second page. Well, yeah, it's at the bottom of the first page, it's indicating that suddenly the garage door began opening. The officer thought that Mom, another car on the scene, might have opened the door. This was not Mom. But in any event, then we go to page 2. He contends that the facts show that the officer was standing directly behind the van. He draws his sidearm, shouts, "Stop the car." John is moving very suddenly, very quickly toward him, and the officer shoots. So as a result of looking at this and comparing it to what they showed, there was a real disconnect, as I said earlier. And so my initial thoughts were to try and figure out what records would be available to establish that these facts were either correct or incorrect. And so initially, some of the requests made went to establish what training the officer had, how long he'd been a police officer, some of the general factual things that you might do in developing just sort of a factual history concerning the officer. Can you put up the July 2nd request? So, initially you don't know what you don't know. And even though you're trying to establish facts that would either affirm or deny the facts as stated by the prosecutor, again, you really don't know what's there, and you begin sort of speculating. One of the speculations I had was on the request number 3 in this document: any employment-related contract between Clayton Jennison, he's the officer involved, and the city of Overland Park, Kansas, or the Overland Park Police Department, regarding his resignation from employment as an officer effective March 4, 2018. They announced at the press conference that he was resigning, that he had resigned. So the reason it was worded in that particular fashion is because of an exclusion in the Kansas Open Records Act. And if you could put up the 45-221, I think it is. Well, yeah, I mean, you can see here, yeah, I'm sorry, let's back up just a second. They on request number 3 for the resignation agreement, they're denying it under 45-221A4, which is referring to the exclusions under the Kansas Open Records Act. And then if we go to the exclusions, this is a huge statute. There are so many exclusions, but with regard to what they were citing, they cited to number 4, the personnel records exception. But there's an exception within the exception. It says that except that this exemption shall not apply to various informations about positions, salaries, and actual compensation employment contracts or employment-related contracts or agreements with regard to the service of officers and employees. So the reason I worded my request as I did was simply to try and fit within this exception within the exclusion that would allow me to obtain the employment-related agreement. Well, anyway, ultimately, they denied that, as you know, and the speculation there initially surrounding that was, what are they trying to do? You know, they initially, I was thinking, were they trying to offer this guy a deal in lieu of prosecuting him? I really wasn't thinking broadly enough, but that was my focus at the time. Were they trying to make him go away on the basis of the fact that they wouldn't charge him? And in a moment, Sheila's going to tell you a little bit more about what happened subsequently. But really, the goal was to find out facts. And so basically, it was a shotgun approach, trying to get everything with regard to use of force training, the investigation that occurred, as well as, background on the officer himself.
So just to kind of dovetail off of what Mark said, that we did retain counsel. We filed a lawsuit in April of 2018. We got very lucky with an excellent federal judge. He denied the city's motion to dismiss the case. And in fact, he wrote, his name is Judge Daniel Crabtree. He wrote a lengthy 22-page order denying their motion to dismiss, laid out some facts in favor of the plaintiff, us, but it did give us some leverage to start poking more holes in the narrative offered by the DA and by the city of Overland Park. A little background too, Overland Park is an affluent suburb of Kansas City. It is, top schools, well-educated, predominantly white community. So these kinds of things are not supposed to happen in a community like ours. As Mark was doing some of these open records requests, and I was kind of getting my head wrapped around the work he was doing, I started to understand. I'm like, he's getting all the background so that we understand how these shootings are investigated and what documents we can get. And I knew Mark had requested that employment agreement and had been denied. But after our litigation was over and we settled the lawsuit and the city tried to get us to sign a non-disclosure agreement, we refused. I knew as soon as the litigation was over that I would pursue telling John's story and correcting the narrative that was put out there. I started to think about, what if they did pay that officer to leave? And you second guess yourself in those situations. You're like, gosh, surely they would not have done that. But I had to bounce that idea off Mark. I bounced it off my husband. And as a former educator, I served in public schools for 20 years. I know that salaries and budgets are all open records. And so a local reporter put in an open records request for payroll information. And this was spring of 2020. So 2 years after John was killed. And he got payroll information for February and March of 2018 and February and March of 2020. And that way, no kind of red flags would go up about what he was requesting. And when the information came in, there were no names attached to the payroll information. It was just revenue sitting there and revenue going out to pay employees. And it was strictly the police department. When I saw the records, I could see day shift, evening shift, night shift. I knew the officer who killed John was an evening shift employee. So I pulled the other stuff out and focused just on the evening shift. And of the 4 pay periods, 2 in February, 2 in March, I noticed one pay period had a significantly larger dollar figure going out. And I said to the reporter, that's where the payment is. And he's a good guy, but he kind of laughed at me a little bit like, Sheila, you have no proof. All that is money going out the door. We don't know it's for the officer. And I said, I'm telling you, it's for the officer. So I had a conversation with a different reporter, and this other reporter said, Sheila, if it's salary, it's public record. Like, you will be able to find it. So I stood in my kitchen and I took my cell phone out and I started typing in Clayton Jennison salary 2018, Clayton Jennison police salary, and up pops an open government data bank with salaries of employees who are paid by tax dollars. And up comes Clayton Jennison 2018, $81,000. And my jaw just dropped. And I turned my phone to my husband and he's like, no way, no second-year officer makes $81,000 a year. And I said, and on top of that, he only worked for 3 weeks in 2018 because he resigned. And that was the game changer for us, because the city then had to reply to a boatload of media requests of why was Clayton Jennison given $81,000 as he exited the police department. And 11,000 of it was legitimate money he was owed, but 70,000 was a severance payment. So it goes back to Mark's open records request. There was an employment agreement, but they were not going to hand it over. So then a local, the Kansas City Star, made an open records request for that severance agreement. They were denied and they filed suit. And then they won and the severance agreement was released. The money that we found in combination with the severance agreement is what opened the Department of Justice Civil Rights investigation into John's death.
That's interesting, because I think one of the first things that I actually received from the state of Alabama was salary information. But this is like, we were asking for employment history of this police officer who was an officer in Troy and Montgomery, and we requested that from both cities, from the state, and everyone's just like redirecting me from one city to the other, to the state, back to the cities. And after the beating, he became a state trooper. And so I'm like, okay, we want to find out whether he is now actually earning more as state trooper than he was a police officer, because the police departments were not giving anything to us. The state personnel office gave us the information that we wanted. So we knew how much he was earning, but we couldn't compare it yet. Eventually, after many iterations of the same public records request, we got some information about his compensation over the years, kind of like settled us like, okay, it was not crazy how much he was getting paid. But that was very important for us to actually just answer questions. I'm wondering with you, Jim, like how did you get to know about the open records request, and like, what are the first things that you were requesting back then?
Immediately, I wanted answers. Why was Craig killed? Because it just did not make any sense. And I started looking at the press releases, and the press releases slowly kept changing a little bit. And I thought this was really odd. And so when I would call and demand answers, why is my buddy dead? They're like, you're going to have to file a public records request. Well, I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do on that. And so I started learning what was the process. And I live on the border of Idaho and Washington. I'm in Spokane, Washington. And so I started doing records requests over in Idaho, and everybody at that time seemed to have different ways of doing it. Every city or town had a different way. And this particular way was filling out a form and emailing it to him. And so I started asking just for interviews, photos. I definitely wanted photos of everything. And it became important to find that information. And it took months because we kept getting told it's under investigation. And so, I've since learned that when an officer involved shooting takes place, or anything officer involved death, you're not going to get a record right away around this area, at least, because they're going to say it's under investigation. And so it took 11 months to finally get records. But when I did, I got a lot of records. And my wife, Kim, and I started pouring through them. And it was amazing what you could find. At one point, I have a different mind of how I look at things than my wife does. And she looks at me and she says, "Why is the gun clean?" And I'm like, "Well, he never fired it." And she's like, no, why is the gun clean? So we're going back and forth and I'm not getting it. She goes, "Look at the gun. There's no dirt on it." And suddenly it hit me. Holy crap. This was never dropped in the dirt. And we started looking, there was no fingerprints on it, no DNA. And then we started finding other things, started getting photos, and it's like, wait, his cell phone was found in his back pocket. It was covered in blood and debris. He never kept his cell phone in his back pocket. And, a lot of guys I know don't keep their phone in their back pocket because when we sit down, we break them. And so that started becoming something odd. And we noticed also, they mentioned that when he walked out the door, his cell phone rang and he silenced it. Well, that started getting me thinking he was probably holding his cell phone, not a gun. And they knew where to find the gun because they had asked his wife earlier, did he have any guns in the house? And so we started looking into all these different things and finding all these problems. And we started doing more records requests. And it was harder to get some of the stuff. We finally got some photos of his clothing. And I'm looking at it one day and I'm just going, something's not right here. And I noticed that he was shot twice, but there was 3 bullet holes. And I'm like, wait a minute. What's going on here? And I noticed the 2 bullet holes were very close to each other. And then I realized that if you take your shirt and you kind of pinch it and fold it down a little bit, and you shoot a bullet through that little fold there on the edge, and then you unfold it, there's 2 bullet holes, which shows to me that when they claimed that he had a gun, he raised it and was charging towards them. He couldn't have had his arm raised, otherwise the clothing wouldn't have been folded there. And so we started digging into that, and also finding out that the trajectory of the bullets, he couldn't even been facing them. So he couldn't have been charging towards them. This is still, there's still a civil case on this. It's taken 5 years. Idaho was very slow on this, but all the officers were found justified, and they dropped the case. We went back to the prosecutor and showed him all the findings of even the sheriff's department deleting evidence, because I have phone records showing that Craig called the sheriff's department the day before trying to make amends, find out what's going on, because he never even knew he had a warrant for his arrest. And the phone records show that he was on a call for about a minute or so, which was, I timed it, it was long enough for a voicemail, because they claim he never talked to anybody. But when I talked to them, they said they replaced their phone system. And I started digging into that. So I did a public records request to find out what was their phone system and when was it replaced, and found out after reviewing those records that they actually have the old phone system. It was required to keep it with the other system, but they're claiming that they don't have any records. So I'm still fighting on that one, trying to figure that one out. But this started having me look at other shootings in our area. And for me, I had no one to turn to. And so when I heard about David Novak being killed in 2019, I immediately started doing records requests on that, and found out that they denied him any medical assistance for 20 minutes. He basically bled out in his doorway. He was unarmed and had not committed a crime. So I reached out to the Novak family, and we became very close. We started working together on public records with their attorney, Rondi Thorpe. And then later that year, in May, Ethan Murray was shot by Spokane deputies. He was unarmed and had not committed a crime. And I did a records request and found out, wait a minute, they claim he had a knife, but he was unarmed. Later on, they found a knife, but then they found out, oh, it was accidentally dropped by a deputy.
That's
And so-
interesting. Yeah, because in our case, the first press release was that this kid in Alabama had a gun, which they found 24 hours later. But after that press release, it was never mentioned again. Not in the cases, not in any news, because there was no gun, and they would not comment about it too. Because yeah, they never explained why did they suddenly say the kid had a gun when he apparently didn't.
It's
So yeah,
interesting how
like,
those press releases
yeah.
slowly start to change.
Yes, yes. Even like Mark's earlier is like mom, even the mom was not really the subject of that thing. So I guess like you were mentioning heavily about like all of these challenges, and I would say like I'm very jealous that you got some things. We're like several years in, and we still, you know, have bits and pieces. We're also like scared of like, you know, dash cam footage getting deleted,
Mhm.
because we're like, who holds this thing? And we don't know. And they've released some to the judge and not really to us or to any of the lawyers. So we don't know. We have a question, or I guess a comment here from Margaret. Strong agreement with how important salary information is. I work at the Full Disclosure Project. We build tools to track police misconduct. In NYC, we found a correlation between officers that are paid the most overtime and officers that are sued the most civilly in court.
Interesting.
Like very interesting.
Yeah, I recently did a public records request for overtime for the sheriff's department and for the police department here in Spokane. And I was amazed to find out that we had officers with over 1,500 hours of overtime.
Oh, very
Yeah.
hardworking.
Yeah.
Very hardworking.
Um,
Well,
You
I
know,
think sorry, Mark.
You ask about challenges, and I think
Yeah.
we've kind of talked about the police investigative exception, that typically when these cases are being investigated by the police and they're active, they certainly will not provide any information to you on that basis. But we also found out then, I also found out that even once the investigation was over, they continued to use that exclusion to deny producing any records. And they would have things like witness statements. The witness who gave a statement might be less likely to do so in the future if they knew that their information was made public, or you might learn some type of secret investigative police technique.
Mm.
And at least with regard to our situation here, the John Halper's killing, we were not able to access the investigative files, but we were very fortunate in that two of our local news agencies picked up the ball and ran, both with regard to the resignation and separation agreement, which was ultimately obtained, and also with regard to the investigation report. I think that's the biggest challenge. Once they deny in Kansas, it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong, or where you argue until you're blue in the face. Your only option at that point is to sue them, and they know that. And unfortunately, that's something that most people don't have the money to do.
Mhm. Mhm.
And we found out, you know, when the Kansas City Star successfully litigated for the severance agreement, the reason they were hiding it was because they agreed to report Jennison's resignation to what they call CPOST. It's the organization that oversees law enforcement licenses in the state of Kansas. Anytime an officer leaves any police department for any reason, they, you know, go to another job, they retire, they're terminated, there's a form that the chief of police has to fill out and sign on the bottom line under perjury of law, stating why the officer is leaving the department. And they put in writing to Jennison that they would report his resignation as resigning for personal reasons under ordinary circumstances.
Mm.
Well, he wasn't resigning for personal reasons, and these were not ordinary circumstances. The city knew that they were going to get served with a civil lawsuit, but they did that as a negotiating tool with him to get him out the door. It is also why this gentleman still has his peace officer license in the state of Kansas, along with his $70,000 severance agreement. So, and it's a way to circumvent the, organizations that are trying to track police misconduct, because there's, he can just kind of disappear off into the sunset and go get hired by another police department. I mean, the only reason his name is released is because we released it in the civil lawsuit. The city was not going to release the officer's name. So there's all kinds of workarounds to avoid transparency and accountability. And the city did eventually release the investigatory file related to John's death, and they redacted out witness names and took out any pictures, which I was grateful for. But we found that the OSIT investigation was predominantly just a record of John's mental health struggles, and actual information about the night of, there was little to no information. So things that you would see in a typical homicide investigation, a scene diagram, a trajectory report, those kinds of things were completely missing from the OSIT report. So I then thought, well, where is that information? It has to exist. So I did an open records request to the county crime lab, and that is where I got a huge chunk of information. I got the trajectory report. And I also found out that most of these crime lab reports were not completed until after the district attorney already cleared the officer. So, and John's investigation was done in 6 days, 6 days.
Oh, wow.
Like, and that no legitimate investigation can be done in that short amount of time. So we were really exposing what is a highly dysfunctional system that we use to investigate officer involved shootings in Johnson County, Kansas. And
I would highlight that like it was very important that you were able to like know where things reside. That's one thing that we were told, I guess, at least as journalists, like, usually my first call to like the department's like, okay, who's your public information officer, or who's your freedom of information officer? Because then you want to talk directly to someone who actually can give you something, and not just like, send it generally to an office, and then because they can just, deny it or just delay you. So yeah, I would like highlight how important it was that you knew where you should be requesting that record.
Well, those records sit at the district attorney's office too. He has denied almost every request I've ever made for information. So I'm like, well, if he's not going to give it to me, then where else can I go? And the crime lab in Johnson County, when I asked for the scene diagram, they put in writing to me, Mrs. Albers, we do not have a scene diagram related to your son's death because the officer involved shooting investigation team did not request one to be created. And that was huge. I mean, I have that piece of paper because that's a failure to do a proper impartial investigation. And it shows that there was zero interest in investigating this properly. Their goal at the beginning was a predetermined outcome. How do we make sure this officer is cleared of any wrongdoing? And they do that by telling false narratives, withholding information, and not looking at the evidence that is sitting right in front of them.
I think in spite of the fact that many of the requests that were really substantive were denied based on the investigative exclusion, it helps to apply pressure through the media. We had some favorable media people who would run stories, and that created somewhat of a groundswell of opinion. And that really helped. that really helped. And certainly I think it helped get the media themselves, the TV station and the Kansas City Star, interested in pursuing litigation to obtain these materials. Without that, I think this just would have been swept under the rug. We have found several other cases in Johnson County that were similar in nature, but people did not jump on the media to get more information.
Oh, I think, okay, there we go.
And I need to do a shout out to the Washington Post. They've been extraordinarily kind to John's case in reporting the facts as we have uncovered them. And I would recommend to anyone with questions that when you do those open records requests and you get facts that contradict the narrative that was put out, find a trusted reporter and share that information, because that is how you'll get policy changes, training changes, because they're not going to, city government, county government, they don't typically come to the table willingly saying, oh yeah, let's go ahead and make some good changes. They do it because they're being kind of forced into the conversation.
Public pressure. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of it, it's networking, getting to know journalists, attorneys. There's a brilliant attorney I work with. He's a civil rights attorney over in Seattle, Braden Pence. He handled the Ethan Murray case. He's actually working on another one that we've looked through, and he's pointing me in directions on what to ask for and how to ask for some things. But even with all that, Mark talked about, having to sue and the cost of things like that to get your public records. I've got records over in Idaho right now that I've never been able to obtain, because even though they're like, yeah, we're going to release them to you, they jack up the prices on it to a point that I can't afford the records now. And when I go to the state attorney general, they're like, well, you're going to have to sue them for it. And it's like, well, I can't afford that either. So there's records sitting over there. But, and because of that, every record that I get that I've obtained, I don't believe other people should have to push for it or pay for it, right? There are records I have not released yet because some family members said, hey, we don't want this out there yet, because they're working with their attorneys and things like that. But most of the records I obtain, majority of them, I put out on a Google Drive, and I make it free to all the journalists, families. I work with all these different families and agencies to make sure that they have access to those records, because they shouldn't have to fight for them as well.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
I've got
that's-
one record, 9 months. I'm still waiting 9 months for one record, and they
I
all
just
become
wanted to,
available after a certain thing happens,
period.
right?
Yeah, no, that's true. I think that's also what we wanted to do with the film, is that, we wanted to share these public records that we were able to gather. Not a lot of them, but at least even how we requested records, like the request that we made, because we did so much. I just wanted to flag to, or at least remind our attendees for questions. We're nearing the end. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to send them in the chat. And I think to kind of just, wrap up our conversation, because a lot of the things we've been talking about, like Jim said, this is all about networking. We had so many people request for the same records. I remember when I first started requesting records in Alabama. I'm based in California, and they said any citizen can request records. Apparently it means any Alabama citizen can request records, and who in Alabama, and it goes on and on and on. And so we had to knock on several doors to really find someone who can get something for us. Deborah Fisher is asking, can you speak to any policy changes that have occurred in your case, if any?
We filed legislation in 2019 to make it so that when an officer involved shooting investigation occurs and the investigation is closed, that then those records would become public.
Mhm.
And we got a hearing, but it never made it out of committee. We will attempt that again down the road after the election, depending on, how November 8th goes. What will determine probably how successful we'll be at getting that legislation changed, because right now they can hide those records forever in Kansas. Another policy change we made in Overland Park, not necessarily related specifically to transparency, but we did get shooting into a moving vehicle banned in Overland Park. It wasn't the night John was killed. And so we had a pretty weak police practice in that regard. And due to public pressure, we got that changed. And we have been successful too at getting a mental health unit created in the police department that responds now to mental health related calls, and additional co-responders, social workers who are going to be working with police officers in those circumstances. So those have been great wins for us. But when it comes to actual policy changes regarding the officer involved shooting investigation team process in Johnson County, I cannot even get our local city council or our local DA to sit at a table and have a conversation about it. They do not want to talk about that system and how it needs to change.
Mhm. I think one thing we can kind of talk about here in the end is about your advice, really, for other citizens going through a tragedy, hopefully not more, but really looking for answers to what would you want to tell them, and what kind of support would you want to have from advocates who may be there and willing to help, like you, for people like you?
I think that what I would recommend the most is to not be afraid. Don't feel like you can't do it. You can Google open records in your state, or the Freedom of Information Act in your state, or we call it the Open Records Act in Kansas. Simply find it, read what it says. Typically, it will tell you exactly what you need to do. There'll be a process and procedure outlined, and the people you're requesting from may not follow it completely, in terms of the number of days and that type of thing. But just don't be afraid. Be diligent. Keep after them. Be persistent.
Mhm.
That's a
Be
good
a
point, Mark.
pest.
Yeah. Spokane Transit Authority, I did a records request with them this few months ago, and the first response they came back with was that they didn't have to give me the records. And I happen to know the public records laws here in Washington, and I said, actually you do. And so they called me up, and I argued with them about it, and then they called me back and said, we just talked with our attorneys, your records are on the way. So a
Mhm.
lot of times these agencies will try to bully you without knowing what they're talking about. You know those laws and push back.
Very
Mhm.
true.
Mhm.
And I would say don't feel like you have to be obviously a reporter or an attorney. Like
Mhm.
Mark writes his from an attorney's perspective, so it's very legal. I write mine, pursuant to Kansas 45-215, please provide me the file. And I just bullet them. Like it doesn't have to be written in legalese.
I write mine as a pain in the butt. I'm like, I want this, give it to me.
Sometimes I feel like I don't even have to sign the bottom. They know exactly who this is, why she's asking, right?
Yeah.
And it fail forward. Sometimes, you request, you get a denial, or sometimes you get a response, you're like, but that's not what I asked for.
Right.
And reach out to other people and say, could I have phrased this differently? Or is there somewhere else I can go, like, to get this record? Or what do you think? Like, we will be much more successful if we work together. I mean, Jim has texted me things. Have you thought about this? I've texted him things. And in both cases, we've gone, oh, I didn't know that.
Mhm.
And that's where, Jim and I have never met face to face, but we communicate all the time.
Right.
And that's how we will change transparency laws and accountability.
And I would give a shout out to NFOIC. NFOIC is like one of the organizations that we reached out to for the film, because we were like, okay, what are more things we need to know, really? And they are just like one of so many. And I know that they provide workshops and stuff like that, and they'd be always willing to like respond to questions. One of the question is, do you have any advice on getting a record unsealed if you have went through kind of that process? It is a sealed document of counseling for an officer, is this person's question. They're involved in an active case, civil case for David Novak. So kind of like if you had any experience kind of unsealing a record.
I mean, the officer who killed my son served 2 tours in the Middle East and openly on like a online resume talked about the 200 combat missions that he facilitated. Do I suspect he suffered from PTSD? Heck yes. Do I think that's what caused him to snap the night he killed John? Yes. Will I ever see his medical records? No. You will never. I mean, that is covered under federal law. People's medical records are typically sealed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For us, it's really just suing. We had the support of the Reports Committee for Freedom of the Press. They didn't really have to sue for certain records, because in the end, a different policy change is that Supreme Court of Alabama last year said, well, now a lot of these law enforcement records are not public anymore. And so that's kind of like the unfortunate policy change that happened to us. Any like last words really that we want to share upon people here? Thank you. Really, Jim?
I just wanted to put if anybody wanted to take a look at the Google Drive, I'm gonna put it in the chat here.
Yes, please do.
Different public records request in it. And so let's see here.
And if there's any last questions from people, please do. Again, thank you much for everyone. If you are interested in watching our film, it's screening, I think, starting this week in 2 festivals online. One is strictly, I guess, in Canada with Twin Cities and with St. John Women's International Film Festival. We're also going to New Orleans Film Festival on November 6th in person. If you are in New Orleans, please feel free to see our film. I put the link on the chat too, if you want to see, where we're screening in, and Jim has the link for the Google Drive. But any other last thoughts?
The Washington Post worked on for almost a year a 18-minute video regarding the circumstances the night John was killed. It was with Tom Jackman's the reporter, and he did it with his visual forensics team. It is outstanding. I don't have the link up there yet, but if you Google the Washington Post, John Albers, the film will come up. They did an excellent job, in my opinion, doing the job of what OSIT should have done, and really clarifying, correcting the false narrative that went out from the city and the DA.
Do we have any, Colleen Murphy, want to thank you, everyone, for sharing your stories. They are extremely impactful and inspiring, especially given that you are dealing with such horrible grief. Yeah, and I would like to say the same of, I'm fortunate, I guess, that I've never had to go through one. I hope I never have to do. And thank you so much for sharing your stories. Sheila was like making me very tearful earlier. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much for NFOIC and for everyone attending this. I believe the recording will be available after this. So, but yeah, thank you again, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank
Thank you all.